Adom. It testified, now I'm quoting, "There was no use of Palestinian ambulances for the transport of weapons or ammunition. It just never happened." Israel destroyed 30 mosques in Gaza, and it damaged 15 more. Israel said, you have to understand, Hamas was using the mosques to store weapons, and it was fighting from the mosques. Well, the Goldstone mission, to which I'll return, the Goldstone mission investigated one case of what it called, and now I'm quoting, an intentional Israeli attack on a mosque that killed 15 people while praying. What did the Goldstone mission conclude? It found no evidence that this mosque was used for the storage of weapons or any military activity by Palestinian armed groups. But Israel said, what about the other mosques? Maybe they were storing weapons there. But there you have a problem nonetheless, because Israel didn't just target the mosques in Gaza, it targeted the minarets. And the minarets in Gaza are very narrow. They don't have staircases, so it was impossible for a sniper to ascend them, and it was impossible for a lookout to ascend them. So if the minarets couldn't possibly have had any military value, why did Israel systematically target them? One of the fact-finding missions did investigate that. The fact-finding mission headed by the distinguished South African jurist John Dugard. John Dugard is often said to be the father of human rights legislation in post-apartheid South Africa. What did he find? He said that the mosques, and more particularly the minarets, had been targeted on the grounds that they symbolized Islam. Well, that's a good reason. You can't quarrel with that. But of course, I'm only telling half the story because I'm partisan, I'm prejudiced, I'm one-sided. Because everybody in the room knows that the real reason Israel ended up targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is because Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields. They were in a cowardly fashion. They were hiding themselves behind Palestinians, forcing Palestinians to face the brunt of Israeli firepower. The Israelis didn't want to kill Palestinians, but they had to. They were forced to because Hamas was using them as human shields. So how many of you in this room are familiar with the allegation that Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields? So raise your hand. Okay, near unanimity. You would have to be suffering from a degenerative brain disease or an excessive consumption of mind-altering drugs not to have heard the allegation because it was so widely disseminated. And all the human rights organizations, of course, they investigated that allegation. They investigated at great length. And they all reached the same conclusion. So if I were to ask this audience, what's the most respected human rights organization in the world, you would all say, Amnesty International. Exactly. So let's see what Amnesty International had to say. It probably issued the most exhaustive study of the human shield issue, and it said the following. Contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. Now here's the interesting question. When I asked how many of you are familiar with the allegation that Hamas used Palestinian civilians as human shields, nearly everyone in the room raised his or her hand. Now, speaking honestly and candidly, how many of you are aware that every human rights organization and fact-finding mission and investigative question reached the same conclusion? There's no evidence that Hamas engaged in human shielding, so raise your hand. Well, look around you. And bear in mind, this is an informed audience, and one generally sympathetic to the rights of Palestinians. It tells you something about the huge gulf that exists between what the mainstream media report and what the findings of the human rights organizations. But even if it were true that Hamas engaged in human shielding, it still couldn't possibly explain the death in Gaza. Why not? Well, let's see what Amnesty had to say. It said, in the attacks that caused the greatest number of fatalities and injuries, Palestinian civilians were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces, nor were the Palestinian victims shielding militants or other legitimate targets. Well, then how did they die? Amnesty says, many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. How did the children die in Gaza? About 358 Palestinian children were killed. How did they die? Was Hamas using them as human shields? Amnesty says the children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. It's emphatically not true, of course, that there was no human shielding in Gaza. Of course, there was extensive human shielding by Israel, using Palestinians as human shields. All the human rights organizations conclude that Israel committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity in Gaza. They also conclude that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but on an incomparably smaller scale. How many crimes can ants commit against a child, incinerating them with a magnifying glass? After those 22 days, many human rights organizations investigated what happened in the course of the Israeli invasion. The best known of the investigations was the one commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council and headed up by Richard Goldstone. Mr. Goldstone was a distinguished South African jurist, and he went on to be the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And within several months' time, he produced the mission he headed, produced a very substantial report running to some 500 densely argued pages. It's impossible, obviously, in the confines of this evening's event to go through with any kind of depth the findings of the Goldstone report, but it is worth reporting what he concluded. First, the Goldstone mission concluded that Israel launched a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. Israel launched a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say Israel launched the attack because of the Hamas rocket and mortar attacks. How could he say that if Israel didn't want Hamas to fire rockets and mortars at Israel? It wouldn't have broken the ceasefire, because it was breaking the ceasefire that triggered those attacks. But maybe all that death, maybe all that destruction was because some Israeli soldiers went berserk. Everyone knows in every army there are some rotten apples. But the Goldstone mission concluded, well, that's just not possible. It said, the systematic and deliberate nature of the activities leave the mission in no doubt that responsibility lies in the first place with those who designed, planned, ordered, and oversaw the operations, that is, Israel's political and military leadership. Well, some people, after the report came out, they said, this is awful extreme. Maybe Mr. Goldstone, he exaggerated a little. The problem was, the Goldstone mission couldn't have concluded anything other than what it concluded, because the Israeli leaders were very forthright, they were very candid before, during, and after the invasion about what they were up to. You can't fault them for being dishonest. They were remarkably forthright. Before the attack, the head of Israel's Northern Command, he said, we will yield disproportionate power against every village from which shots are fired in Israel. We will cause immense damage and destruction. The former chief of Israel's National Security Council, he said before the attack, the next war will lead to intense suffering among the enemy population, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, and the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people. During the invasion, Israel